The morning sun cast long shadows across the private aviation terminal as Dr. Sarah Thompson pulled up in her Tesla Model X. She checked her watch, 7:15 a.m. Perfect timing for her 8 o'clock a.m. flight to Chicago, where she would be giving the keynote speech at a major medical conference. Sarah adjusted her navy blue blazer and grabbed her leather briefcase from the passenger seat. At 42, she had already achieved what many would consider the pinnacle of success. As one of the few black female neurosurgeons in the country, she had saved countless lives and earned numerous awards for her groundbreaking research in pediatric brain surgery. The cool morning air felt refreshing against her face as she walked toward the terminal entrance. Her heels clicked confidently against the polished floor, a sound she had grown accustomed to over her 15 years of taking private flights for medical conferences and emergency surgeries. The familiar smell of coffee from the terminal's premium lounge drifted through the air, mixing with the distinct scent of jet fuel from the nearby runway. Several other passengers were already in the terminal, mostly business executives in expensive suits, engaged in quiet conversation or typing away on their laptops. A few looked up and nodded in greeting, something Sarah was used to as a regular at this private terminal. She had been flying through this same terminal for the past 5 years, ever since her hospital network had partnered with Elite Aviation Services. Sarah approached the check-in counter where Linda, one of the regular morning staff members, usually greeted her with a warm smile. But today, Linda wasn't there. Instead, she saw an unfamiliar security guard standing near the counter, his eyes following her movement with unusual intensity. The name tag on his uniform read, Richard Wells. As she walked closer, Sarah noticed something shift in the guard's posture. His shoulders stiffened, and his hand moved slightly closer to his security radio. She had seen this body language before, the supple signs of prejudice she had faced throughout her career, despite her achievements. Still, Sarah maintained her professional demeanor. She pulled out her identification, flight documentation, and medical credentials, a routine she had performed hundreds of times before. Her conference presentation files were safely stored in her tablet, and her overnight bag contained just the essentials for her 2-day trip. The terminal's large windows offered a clear view of her waiting aircraft, a sleek Gulfstream G650, its white paint gleaming in the morning sun. Sarah could see the ground crew performing their pre-flight checks, and the pilot had already arrived, doing his external inspection of the aircraft. She thought about the presentation she would be giving in just a few hours. Her research on minimally invasive techniques for pediatric brain tumors had shown promising results, and she was excited to share these findings with her colleagues. The lives of countless children could be improved with these new methods. As she approached the security checkpoint, Sarah pulled up her digital boarding pass on her phone. She had already received several messages from the conference organizers confirming her arrival time and the schedule for her presentation. Everything was perfectly in order, just as she liked it. What Sarah didn't know was that this ordinary morning was about to turn into one of the most challenging experiences of her professional life. The security guard, Richard Wells, had only been working at the terminal for 3 months, and his prejudices were about to create a situation that would not only impact Sarah's day, but would eventually lead to significant changes in the private aviation industry. The gentle hum of the terminal's air conditioning and the distant sound of jet engines created a familiar backdrop as Sarah prepared to present her credentials. She had no way of knowing that in the next few minutes, her status as a respected medical professional would be questioned in a way that would shock everyone present in the terminal that morning. Richard Wells stood at his post, his eyes fixed on Dr. Sarah Thompson as she approached the security checkpoint. Something about her presence made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't logically explain why. The crisp uniform he wore felt a bit tighter as he straightened his back, preparing to assert his authority. "Ma'am, I need to see your credentials," Wells said, his voice carrying a sharp edge that made several nearby passengers look up from their phones and laptops. His tone was notably different from how he had spoken to the previous travelers, all white executives, who had passed through just minutes earlier. Sarah calmly presented her identification, boarding pass, and medical credentials. "Here you are. I'm Dr. Sarah Thompson, and I'm running a bit late for my flight to Chicago. I have a medical conference presentation this afternoon." Wells picked up her documents, turning them over in his hands with exaggerated scrutiny. "These look irregular," he said, though there was nothing unusual about them. "How did you get access to this terminal?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. A few feet away, an elderly businessman lowered his newspaper, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I've been flying through this terminal for 5 years," she explained patiently. "Our hospital network has a partnership with Elite Aviation Services. You can verify this with your supervisor or check the system." Wells ignored her suggestion to verify her credentials. Instead, he began a series of increasingly aggressive questions. "And how did you afford a private jet flight? What hospital did you say you work at? Why haven't I seen you here before?" Each question felt like a small cut, precise and deliberate. Sarah noticed a young woman at the coffee counter had taken out her phone and was quietly recording the interaction. The terminal, usually filled with the soft murmur of business conversations, had grown unusually quiet. "I'm the head of neurosurgery at Metropolitan General," Sarah replied, maintaining her composure. "And as I mentioned, these flights are part of our hospital's corporate agreement. If you check your system." "Don't tell me how to do my job," Wells interrupted, his face reddening. "Something doesn't add up here. I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening." A few gasps could be heard from the growing audience of travelers. Sarah felt her palms grow slightly damp, but she kept her professional demeanor. She had faced discrimination before, but never so blatantly in her professional space. "Sir," she said firmly, "I understand you're doing your job, but I provided all the necessary documentation. I have surgery scheduled tomorrow, and I cannot miss this flight. Please check the system as I suggested." Wells reached for his radio, his hand slightly shaking with what appeared to be anger rather than nervousness. "Security backup to main checkpoint," he barked into the device. "We have an uncooperative passenger attempting to access a private flight." The words "uncooperative passenger" echoed through the terminal, causing more phones to emerge from pockets and purses, the cameras now focused on the unfolding scene. Sarah stood perfectly still, her years of surgical training helping her maintain steady hands despite the adrenaline coursing through her body. An older woman in a business suit stepped forward, her face showing clear disapproval of Wells' behavior. But before she could speak, Wells raised his hand in a stopping motion. "Ma'am, please stay back. This is a security matter." Sarah caught her reflection in the terminal's window, her poised stance, her professional attire, her calm expression masking the storm of emotions beneath. Behind her, she could see her waiting aircraft, its engines still quiet, its cabin still empty. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the sky, marking the passing minutes that pushed her closer to being late for her crucial presentation. What nobody in the terminal knew yet was that this confrontation was about to escalate into something much bigger than a simple security check. The next few minutes would not only change Sarah's day, but would spark a nationwide conversation about prejudice in private aviation. The situation in the terminal reached a breaking point as two additional security guards rushed to Wells' location. By now, at least 15 passengers had gathered nearby, many of them recording the scene on their phones. The morning sunlight streaming through the terminal's windows cast harsh shadows across Wells' increasingly agitated face. "This woman is refusing to comply with security protocols," Wells announced to his colleagues, loud enough for everyone to hear. The two newly arrived guards, Officers Martinez and Chen, exchanged uncertain glances. They had both seen Dr. Thompson at the terminal before and knew her as a regular passenger. Officer Martinez stepped forward carefully. "Sir, I recognize Dr. Thompson. She's a regular." "That's not possible," Wells cut him off sharply. "She doesn't fit the profile of our usual passengers. I need to see proof that she belongs here." His emphasis on the word proof made several onlookers shake their heads in disgust. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering the breathing techniques she used during lengthy surgeries. "Officer Martinez, thank you. Mr. Wells, I've shown you my ID, medical credentials, and flight documentation. I've explained my hospital's partnership with Elite Aviation. What additional proof could you possibly need?" A distinguished-looking man in his 60s suddenly stepped out from the small crowd. "Wait a minute," he said, his eyes widening with recognition. "Aren't you Dr. Sarah Thompson who performed that groundbreaking surgery on the Williams twins last month? I saw you on the morning news." The man turned to Wells, his voice sharp with authority. "I'm Robert Davidson, board member of Chicago Memorial Hospital." Dr. Thompson is one of the most respected pediatric neurosurgeons in the country. This is absolutely outrageous. Wells' face flushed red, but he stood his ground. Sir, with all due respect, I need to follow proper security protocols. What protocols? Another voice called out. A woman in a pilot's uniform had emerged from the crew area. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, scheduled to fly the Chicago route, had heard the commotion. I've flown Dr. Thompson multiple times. She's cleared for all elite aviation flights through the hospital's executive program. The terminal had grown completely silent except for the soft whirring of the air conditioning and the occasional click of phone cameras. Sarah noticed that several passengers were now making phone calls, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Some were typing rapidly on their phones, and she could only imagine the social media posts being created. Wells began to look uncertain, but instead of backing down, he became more aggressive. Everyone stepped back, he demanded, his hand now resting on his security baton. This is a restricted area, and I'm in charge of security here. Officer Chen spoke into his radio, his voice low but clear. We need a supervisor to the main checkpoint immediately. He had noticed Wells' hand on his baton and recognized the situation was spiraling out of control. Sarah remained still, her heart pounding but her exterior calm. Years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught her the importance of staying composed. She checked her watch, 7:40 a.m. Her presentation in Chicago was scheduled for 2:00 p.m., and this delay was putting everything at risk. Mr. Wells, she said, her voice steady and clear, I understand you're trying to do your job, but your actions right now appear to be based on prejudice rather than any legitimate security concern. I suggest you check with your supervisor before this situation escalates further. The word prejudice seemed to echo through the terminal. Several passengers nodded in agreement, and more phones were raised to record the scene. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked loudly, Mom, why is that guard being mean to the doctor? The child's innocent question hung in the air, making the discrimination even more apparent. Wells opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a new figure rushed into the scene. James Anderson, the regional manager of Elite Aviation Services. His face showed a mix of concern and embarrassment as he took in the situation before him. Unknown to everyone present, this confrontation had already begun spreading across social media platforms. By the time Anderson arrived at the scene, the first tweets about the incident had already gained hundreds of retweets, and a video clip was beginning to go viral. James Anderson, the regional manager, moved quickly through the terminal, his face showing deep concern. He had rushed over from his office after receiving multiple urgent calls about the situation. The sound of his hurried footsteps made Wells turn around, his hand still resting on his security baton. What on earth is going on here? Anderson demanded, his voice carrying across the now silent terminal. His eyes moved from Wells to Dr. Thompson, then to the crowd of passengers with their phones raised, recording everything. Sir, Wells started, standing straighter, I was conducting a security check on this. Individual who? This individual is Dr. Sarah Thompson, Anderson interrupted, his face reddening with embarrassment. She's one of our most valued clients and has been flying with us for years. He turned to Sarah, his expression apologetic. Dr. Thompson, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am for this situation. Wells' face went through a series of emotions, confusion, defiance, and finally, a hint of uncertainty. But sir, I was following protocol. She didn't seem like she belonged. Didn't belong. A new voice rang out. It was Mrs. Patricia Chen, a senior board member of Elite Aviation, who had just arrived after being alerted about the commotion. She had been in a meeting in one of the terminal's private rooms. And what exactly does someone who belongs here look like, Mr. Wells? The question hung in the air like a heavy weight. Several passengers nodded in approval, while others continued recording. Wells shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware of how his words sounded. Sarah spoke up, her voice steady and professional. Mr. Anderson, Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your intervention. However, I'm now running late for a critical presentation at Chicago Children's Hospital. There are families waiting to hear about new treatment options for their children. Anderson immediately sprang into action. Captain Rodriguez, please begin immediate preparations for takeoff. He turned to Wells, his voice stern. Mr. Wells, You are relieved of your duties effective immediately. Please report to HR before leaving the premises. Wells' face turned pale. But sir, I was just... Just what? Mrs. Chen interrupted. Just profiling one of our most respected clients. Just ignoring her valid credentials. Just threatening her with a baton. She gestured to his hand, which was still resting on his security weapon. Officer Martinez stepped forward. Sir, we need your badge and radio. Wells looked around, perhaps hoping to find support from someone, but found only disapproving faces. Slowly, he unpinned his badge and handed over his radio. As Wells was escorted away by Officers Martinez and Chen, Anderson turned back to Sarah. Dr. Thompson, please allow me to personally escort you to your aircraft. We'll have your luggage brought immediately. The crowd of onlookers began to disperse, but not before many of them approached Sarah to express their support. The elderly businessman who had watched the entire scene unfold handed her his business card. Dr. Thompson, I'm on the board of several hospitals. We need to talk about making sure this never happens again. Captain Rodriguez appeared again. Dr. Thompson, we've received clearance for immediate takeoff. We'll make up the lost time in the air. You won't be late for your presentation. As Sarah walked toward her plane, escorted by Anderson and Mrs. Chen, she could hear snippets of conversations behind her. Passengers were already sharing their videos and talking about how quickly the incident had spread on social media. Someone mentioned that a major news network had already picked up the story. The morning sun was now higher in the sky as Sarah climbed the steps to board her plane. She turned briefly, looking back at the terminal where dozens of people were still watching. In that moment, she realized that what had started as a horrible display of prejudice had transformed into something powerful, a clear demonstration that people were ready to stand up against discrimination. Inside the plane, as she settled into her seat, Sarah's phone buzzed with messages of support from colleagues who had already seen the viral videos. But amidst all the chaos and attention, her mind was already shifting to her upcoming presentation. She'd had children and families counting on her, and she wasn't going to let this incident distract her from her mission to help them. During the flight to Chicago, Dr. Sarah Thompson's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. The videos of her confrontation with Wells had spread across social media like wildfire. As Captain Rodriguez guided the private jet through clear skies, Sarah watched the incident transform from a personal encounter into a national conversation about racism in corporate spaces. Dr. Thompson, the flight attendant, Maria, said softly, CNN is running the story on their website now. She turned her tablet to show Sarah the headline, Renowned neurosurgeon racially profiled at private aviation terminal. Incident caught on video. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering all the similar incidents in her life that hadn't been captured on camera. Through the plane's window, she watched clouds drift by, thinking about how this very public incident might help create real change. Her phone rang. It was Dr. Michael Chen, chief of surgery at Chicago Children's Hospital. Sarah, we've seen the videos, he said, his voice filled with concern. Do you want to postpone your presentation? Everyone would understand. No, Sarah replied firmly, her voice steady. These children and their families have been waiting for months to hear about these new surgical techniques. I won't let one man's prejudice affect their hope for treatment. As she reviewed her presentation slides, social media continued to explode with activity. The elderly businessman from the terminal, Robert Davidson, had posted a lengthy LinkedIn article about witnessing the incident. His post was being shared thousands of times, particularly among medical and aviation professionals. A notification popped up on her tablet. Someone had recognized her from a different context. A mother named Jennifer Williams had shared a touching post. This is the same Dr. Thompson who saved my twins last month. She spent hours explaining the complicated surgery to us, showing such patience and care. To see her treated this way is heartbreaking. #Stand with Dr. Thompson. The hashtag Stand with Dr. Thompson was trending now, with medical professionals across the country sharing their own experiences with discrimination. Black doctors, pilots, and executives were posting stories that echoed Sarah's experience, turning her incident into a catalyst for a larger discussion. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. Dr. Thompson, we're making good time. We should arrive in Chicago 30 minutes ahead of schedule, thanks to favorable winds. Sarah nodded, grateful for the extra time. She opened her email to find hundreds of unread messages, including one from the American Medical Association. They wanted her to speak at their upcoming conference about breaking barriers in medicine. Another email came from a major publishing house interested in her story. Looking through the messages, one particularly caught her eye. It was from a young black girl named Destiny, a high school student. Dear Dr. Thompson, I watched what happened to you today. I want to be a neurosurgeon too, but sometimes I worry it's too hard, that there are too many obstacles. But seeing you stand there, so strong and professional, makes me believe I can do it too. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she read Destiny's message. She remembered being that young girl once, looking up to the few black female doctors she could find, holding onto their examples like precious gems. The plane began its descent into Chicago, and Sarah could see the city's skyline through her window. Her phone buzzed again. Elite Aviation CEO had just released a public statement announcing a comprehensive review of their security protocols and the implementation of mandatory diversity training for all staff. As the plane touched down, Sarah noticed a small crowd gathered near the private terminal. They were holding signs. Welcome Dr. Thompson and Black Excellence in Medicine. Among them were several of her colleagues from Chicago Children's Hospital, showing their support. The flight attendant helped her gather her things, saying quietly, Dr. Thompson, my daughter wants to be a doctor. Thank you for showing her it's possible. Sarah stepped off the plane into the bright Chicago morning, her presentation ready and her spirit unbroken. What Wells had intended as an act of discrimination had transformed into a powerful moment of change, inspiring conversations and actions that would ripple through multiple industries. As she walked toward the terminal, Sarah straightened her blazer and checked her watch. She had a presentation to give, children to help, and now, unexpectedly, a much larger platform from which to create positive change. The conference hall at Chicago Children's Hospital was packed beyond capacity. News of the morning's incident had spread quickly, and many hospital staff members who weren't originally planning to attend Dr. Thompson's presentation had shown up to show their support. The room, designed to hold 200 people, now had nearly 300 packed inside, with more watching through the doorways. Sarah stood backstage, taking slow, measured breaths. Her presentation on new pediatric neurosurgery techniques was ready, but she knew this session would be about more than just medical procedures. Through the curtain, she could hear the excited murmur of the crowd. Dr. Lisa Martinez, the hospital's chief of pediatrics, approached the podium to introduce her. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Sarah Thompson with us, though some of you may have already seen her on social media this morning. A ripple of knowing murmurs passed through the audience. But what you may not know is that Dr. Thompson has developed a revolutionary technique that could save thousands of children's lives. As Sarah walked onto the stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation. She saw phones being raised, but this time not to record an incident of discrimination. Instead, they were capturing a moment of triumph. In the front row, she noticed a group of young black medical students, their faces beaming with pride and admiration. Thank you, Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. This morning, someone tried to tell me I didn't belong, but I'm here because there are children who need us, families who need hope, and medical science that needs to move forward. She clicked to her first slide, showing the image of a child's brain scan. And this is what belonging really looks like. It looks like saving lives. For the next hour, Sarah delivered her presentation with the same precision she used in the operating room. She explained her new surgical techniques using simple terms that even the non-medical people in the audience could understand. When she showed videos of successful surgeries using her method, several parents in the audience wiped away tears. During the question and answer session, a young resident raised her hand. Dr. Thompson, after what happened this morning, how do you maintain such composure and focus? Sarah smiled, considering her answer carefully. In the operating room, we can't let anything distract us from our purpose. Personal feelings, outside problems, even discrimination, they all have to wait, because at that moment, someone's child is counting on us to be at our best. As she continued answering questions, her phone silently buzzed in her pocket. Elite Aviation's board of directors had called an emergency meeting. The incident had sparked a massive response from their high-profile clients, with many threatening to take their business elsewhere unless significant changes were made. The presentation concluded with another standing ovation. As people filed out of the hall, many stopped to shake Sarah's hand or take pictures with her. A group of black medical students waited patiently to speak with her, each of them holding copies of her research papers. Dr. Thompson, one of them said, her voice trembling slightly, "We started a study group because of you. We call ourselves the Thompson Scholars." Sarah's eyes moistened as she hugged each of them. She remembered her own struggles through medical school, how often she had been the only black woman in her classes. Now, looking at these young faces full of determination and hope, she saw the future of medicine. As she gathered her materials, Dr. Martinez approached her again. "Sarah, the hospital board wants to speak with you. They're thinking about starting a diversity initiative in your name, and CNN is outside. They want an interview about both the incident and your groundbreaking work." Sarah checked her watch. The day wasn't even half over, and already so much had changed. What had started as an ugly incident of discrimination had transformed into a platform for positive change. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her old mentor from medical school. "You didn't just prove him wrong, Sarah. You proved everyone who ever doubted you wrong." Outside the conference hall, reporters waited with their cameras, and social media continued to buzz with her story. But Sarah's mind was already on her next task. She had a television interview to give, and she was going to use it to talk about more than just this morning's incident. She was going to talk about change, about hope, and about the future she could see coming. The CNN interview took place in a quiet corner of Chicago Children's Hospital. Sarah sat across from reporter Michelle Chen, who had rushed from New York to cover both the morning's incident and Dr. Thompson's breakthrough medical work. The camera crew adjusted their lights as hospital staff peeked curiously through the windows. "Dr. Thompson," Michelle began, "your story has gone viral. The video of this morning's incident has over 5 million views. What would you like to say to Richard Wells, the security guard who profiled you?" Sarah paused thoughtfully before answering. "I would tell them that his actions, though hurtful, have started an important conversation. Sometimes it takes an ugly moment to create beautiful change." As they continued the interview, Sarah's phone kept lighting up with notifications. Elite Aviation CEO had just announced major changes: mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, a new diversity officer position, and a scholarship program for minority students interested in aviation careers. They were calling it the Thompson Initiative. "Your medical presentation today was also groundbreaking," Michelle continued. "How you balance these professional achievements with being thrust into the spotlight as a symbol of resistance against discrimination?" Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed with an urgent message. The American Medical Association wanted her to lead a new task force on diversity in medicine. Another message followed. 3 major airlines wanted to partner with her hospital network to prevent similar incidents in their first-class lounges. "You see," Sarah said, gesturing to her phone, "this is exactly what I mean about change. What happened this morning was wrong, but look at the response. Companies are taking action. People are speaking up. Stories that were once hidden are now being heard." The interview was interrupted by excited voices in the hallway. A group of young patients in wheelchairs had gathered outside, holding handmade signs. "Dr. Thompson is our hero, and thank you for saving lives." Their parents stood behind them, many wiping away tears. Michelle turned to capture this moment, but Sarah gently raised her hand. "No, please. These children deserve their privacy. This is why I do what I do, not for cameras, not for recognition, but for them." After the interview, Sarah checked her social media. The hashtag Stand with Dr. Thompson had evolved into hashtag Thompson Effect, with people sharing stories of standing up against discrimination in their own workplaces. A video of a black female pilot defending another woman from similar profiling had gone viral, with the caption, "Inspired by Dr. Thompson." Her email inbox was overwhelming. Speaking requests from medical schools, diversity conferences, and corporate training programs flooded in. But one email stood out. It was from Richard Wells himself. "Dr. Thompson," it read, "watching the news coverage today, seeing your medical presentation, understanding who you really are, I am deeply ashamed of my actions. My behavior this morning came from prejudices I didn't even realize I carried. I've lost my job, but more importantly, I've lost my self-respect. I would like to learn from this mistake." Sarah showed the email to her assistant, Jessica. "Schedule a meeting with him," she said. "Not for forgiveness, but for education. Sometimes the best way to fight prejudice is to help people understand their own biases. As evening approached, Sarah received another surprising call. The governor wanted to appoint her to a state commission on workplace discrimination. Major hospitals across the country were calling to request her input on their diversity programs. A publishing house had offered her a book deal to share her story. Looking out the hospital window at the Chicago skyline, Sarah thought about how much had changed in just one day. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother. "Baby," her mom said, voice full of emotion, "I just saw you on CNN. You didn't just stand up for yourself today. You stood up for all of us." Sarah smiled, remembering all the times her mother had faced similar discrimination with the same quiet dignity. "Mom, remember when you told me that sometimes life gives you a moment to make a difference?" "Yes, baby." "Well, I think this is that moment, and I'm going to make it count." As the sun set over Chicago, Sarah began making plans. Tomorrow, she would return to her patients, continue her vital work, but now she had a larger platform from which to create change. What had started as one guard's prejudice had sparked a movement, and Dr. Sarah Thompson was ready to lead it. 6 months had passed since the incident at the private aviation terminal. Dr. Sarah Thompson stood at a podium in Elite Aviation's main conference center, looking out at a very different audience than she was used to. Instead of medical professionals, she faced a room full of aviation industry executives, security personnel, and corporate trainers. "Change," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "doesn't always come from comfortable places. Sometimes it takes an uncomfortable moment to open our eyes." The screen behind her showed statistics about discrimination in private aviation, numbers that had shocked the industry into action. In the front row sat Richard Wells, the former security guard whose actions had sparked this transformation. After their meeting 3 months ago, he had become an unexpected ally in the fight against discrimination. Today, he worked with a civil rights organization, sharing his story as a warning about unchecked bias. "Mr. Wells," Sarah said, gesturing to him, "would you like to share your perspective?" The audience turned as Wells stood up, his face showing both shame and determination. "6 months ago, I was the problem," he said, his voice slightly shaking. "Today, I'm part of the solution. Dr. Thompson taught me that change is possible if we're willing to learn from our mistakes." The presentation continued with Sarah showing the impressive results of the Thompson Initiative. In just 6 months, Elite Aviation had hired 30% more minority staff members. Their new training program, developed with Sarah's input, had been adopted by 12 other private aviation companies. But the changes went far beyond aviation. The American Medical Association's Diversity Task Force, which Sarah now led, had created new guidelines for hospitals nationwide. Medical schools reported a significant increase in applications from minority students, many citing the Thompson effect as their inspiration. After the presentation, Sarah checked her schedule with Jessica, her assistant. Tomorrow, she would perform surgery on twin girls from Minnesota, a case remarkably similar to the Williams twins she had treated before. The day after, she would speak at a high school career fair where Destiny, the young girl who had emailed her 6 months ago, would introduce her. Dr. Thompson, a young security officer, approached her after the presentation. "I'm one of the new hires under the Thompson Initiative. Thank you for making this possible." Sarah noticed his badge shone with pride on his uniform. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her publisher. Her book, Breaking Barriers: Medicine, Prejudice, and the Power of Change, was set to release next month. Pre-orders had already exceeded expectations. As she packed up her materials, Robert Davidson, the elderly businessman who had supported her that morning at the terminal, woke up. Now a key supporter of the Thompson Initiative, he had helped fund scholarships for minority students in both aviation and medicine. "Sarah," he said warmly, "have you seen today's numbers? 28 private aviation companies have adopted our training program. That's twice what we projected." Sarah smiled, remembering how far things had come. The viral video of her confrontation with Wells had now become a teaching tool in corporate training sessions across America. But more importantly, it had given others the courage to speak up about their own experiences. Later that evening, as Sarah drove home, she passed the private aviation terminal where it all began. The security booth where Wells had once stood was now staffed by a diverse team of officers, all trained under the new protocols. The terminal itself had been renamed the Unity Terminal, a symbol of the industry's commitment to change. At a red light, Sarah checked her email one last time. There was a message from a young black girl in Texas who wanted to become a pilot, another from a medical student in Chicago who had just aced his boards, and one from a security guard in Atlanta who had stood up against discrimination at his workplace. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah thought about how one moment of confrontation had created ripples of change across the country. Her mother's words rang in her ears. Sometimes life gives you a moment to make a difference. That moment had come on a sunny morning 6 months ago, when a security guard's prejudice had met a doctor's dignity. The result wasn't just a viral video or a news story. It was a movement that continued to grow, touching lives and changing minds, one person at a time. Sarah smiled as she walked into her home. Tomorrow would bring new surgeries, new challenges, and new opportunities to make a difference. The Thompson effect, as people called it now, wasn't just about fighting discrimination. It was about transforming it into something positive, something that could change the world. One person, one moment, one story at a time.